Adna F Weber was an American statistician and economist, born in 1870 in New York State. He was no relation to the German sociologist Max Weber, even though they were born in the same decade of the 19th century. Adna Weber died in 1968, outliving his German namesake by over 40 years. Weber studied at Cornell University and then did graduate work at Columbia University as well as in Berlin. He went on to a long career as the Deputy Commissioner for Labor Statistics for the state of New York and remained active in both research and applied work as a pioneer of statistics about cities and the labor force. Weber's doctoral dissertation at Columbia University won the Grant Squires Prize for Best Dissertation in 1899 and was published by Cornell University Press as a book, The Growth of Cities in the 19th Century. His book became one of the most well-known and widely cited studies of the urbanization process in the United States. It had a powerful effect on later scholars all over the world and continues to be cited by researchers even today. He published this article we are reading a few years later in 1904 in order to focus on one or two important points that he had been thinking about since finishing the larger book. Which can be a little flowery and more than a little old-fashioned. We need to keep in mind that Adna Weber's article on city growth was published more than 100 years ago. When he wrote this piece in about 1900, there were only 66 million people in the United States, about 1/5 of the total today. Only 40% of them lived in places larger than 2,500 people, and only 20% of them lived in cities of 100,000 or more. Weber's study of the growth of cities in the 19th century offers us one of the earliest pictures of the urbanization process in this country, when New York City had about 3 million people and only Chicago and Philadelphia were above 1 million. Other cities like Detroit, Washington, D.C., or New Orleans only had about 250,000 people each. He opens this article by reviewing a complaint against cities that was common among European scholars and public officials in those days, that urban life was bad for the morality and health of people living in cities. Weber dismisses these worries when it comes to American cities, though, because according to his figures presented on page 30, U.S. cities were more spread out on the landscape, with only about half the population density found in similar-sized cities in Europe. His explanation for this dramatic difference is that most U.S. cities represented new growth, while the cities of Europe occupied sites that had been urban for centuries. Their crowded streets were, he said, quote, a sign that medievalism is not yet outgrown, unquote. In fact, this spread-out character of American cities raises a problem that Weber says we have trouble solving. How can we draw the line between urban and rural places? He singles out two characteristics that still combine to give us this dividing line today: the number of people found in a place and the legal status of the place as an organized or incorporated community. After reviewing standards such as the Census Bureau's selection of 2,500 people as the lower limit for an urban place, he declares that he prefers a boundary line at 10,000 people instead. He also provides an additional way to define an urban place, though. Even some settlements with less than 10,000 people, which he calls villages, do not strictly meet his standard of what counts as urban. He admits that these small places do require community services, such as water and sewer lines, street construction, and perhaps a post office, school, and other community buildings. Villagers are merchants and traders, he says, hence do not belong to the rural population. But he still thinks such places should not be counted as urban. His reason for this judgment provides a very early example of a fully sociological definition of urbanism. He insists that even in these settled communities, every villager knows all of his fellow villagers. They maintain what later sociologists would call primary relationships, and village life is, in his word, homogeneous. Urban life, then, becomes as much a psychological category for Adna Weber as a strictly demographic category based on numbers of people. Here is his thoroughly social psychological description of what it means to live in a truly urban setting. Quote, "It is only when the community becomes too large for every member to be his fellow citizen's neighbor that the provincialism of rural life begins to break down and give place to the liberality of cities. The psychological effect of the mental freedom that is assured by cities to the individual swallowed up by the mass is far-reaching." Unquote. He also thinks that it is worth making the difference between small cities with less than 100,000 people and the bigger ones that cross this second line. Again, his reasoning for such a boundary has to do with the qualitative difference in the ways that people interact in small and large cities. These boundaries, 2,500 people, 10,000 people, or 100,000 people, appear again and again in the work of later scholars, not only in the United States, but also in international research on the urbanization process. This article by Adna F and Weber, summing up some of the ideas contained in his massive book on American cities, published earlier in the 1890s, gives us a kind of foundation for our study of modern urban life and structure. In the section of his article, Adna Weber goes into details about the population of different size classes of American cities, comparing the 1890 and 1900 census results he had available to him. For some reason, he does not use his preferred 10,000 population definition here, but rather starts his urban categories at 8,000 instead. At the bottom of his first table of census results on page 34, he presents us with the remarkable fact that the U.S. population grew by 20% in just the 10 years between 1890 and 1900, as a great wave of immigration in those years combined with high rates of natural increase to inflate the population dramatically. To achieve this rate of growth between 2010 and 2020, the United States would need to add over 6 million new inhabitants every year for the entire decade. This certainly is not happening today. The rural population shown in the first line of this table grew at less than half the rate of the total population, while the large city category, that is, places with over 100,000 people, grew at more than twice the average national rate, an increase of almost 50% in only 10 years. No U.S. city is growing at anything like this rate today. It's growing so much faster than the rural population at the turn of the last century. Weber considers all the different angles of arithmetic that could produce this result, again giving us a foretaste of the logic and the analytic categories to be used by scholars who followed him several decades later. He begins with one of the factors that often gets forgotten when we look for sources of urbanization. As he puts it, quote, "In a territory in which there was an increasing population, but no migration whatever, and not a single city, we should still see a relative decline in the rural population brought about by the growth of villages into cities." Unquote. In other words, the very same people living in the very same houses might be classified as rural in one census and then be classified as urban in a later census if the surrounding community added more and more households over time. This source of urbanization usually is called reclassification, because it just relabels a particular place from rural to urban based on population growth. In fact, Weber is disturbed by this problem of reclassification of places. Even with no migration at all, and if every village and town and city grew by natural increase at exactly the same rate, some places would cross the urban line and shift all of their residents from the rural side of the ledger to the urban side, making it look like cities were growing faster. To take account of this problem, he groups together places by size in 1900 and then includes only exactly the same places from the 1890 census, even if they were in a smaller size class at the earlier date. When he makes this change, we clearly see in his table on page 35 that part of the reason for what looked like super fast growth of the largest cities was simply the result of some smaller cities crossing the line of 100,000 people and bringing all their people into that category by the time of the 1900 census. When we look at groups in this table that include only the same places over time, the rate of growth for all urban places looks remarkably uniform. Just over 30% increase between 1890 and 1900 in all the categories. This is still faster than the national average rate of increase, though. The growth rate of the majority of the population, still found in rural areas, remained much slower than the national average. Although he does not spell it out at this point in the article, this slower growth of rural population and faster growth of urban population must be due to rural-urban migration. The rate of natural increase, taking births minus deaths, was actually higher in rural areas than in cities, so without some migration to cities, the rural population should have been growing faster than the national average, not more slowly. Once he has established this pattern of faster than average growth of urban areas, without even bothering to document or discuss the actual migration of people from the countryside into cities, Weber finally gets around to the punchline of his article. The title of the article includes the phrase, "The Era of Small Industrial Centers," which actually explains why he wrote this article in the first place. On pages 36 through 39, he concentrates on the fastest growing cities of all, those experiencing population growth of more than 60% each during the single decade between 1890 and 1900. Interestingly, none of the biggest cities in the country appear on this list. Weber says that this is because they had already grown so large that land prices got too high to be competitive, and that even 100 years ago, businesses were shopping around among cities to find what we today would call the right business climate for setting up new enterprises. Weber starts by dismissing any city on this list that was west of the Mississippi River because he feels that rapid growth of cities in new territory needs no further explanation. But why are some cities in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, East Coast states already completely settled and built up, also growing at such a rapid pace? Weber's explanation is that manufacturing jobs were appearing in these smaller cities as part of what he calls, quote, "the movement of manufacturing industry away from the large cities," unquote. He also points out that, quote, "southern cotton factories are almost invariably located in small towns that are still in the village stage of development," unquote. By linking the growth of U.S. cities to the spread of manufacturing jobs and industrial expansion, Weber is laying the groundwork for one of the most fundamental assumptions of urban scholars, that the urbanization of society is part of a larger process that also includes the economic transformation of that society from a rural agricultural way of life to a new urban setting featuring industrial jobs. This basic linkage will appear in the assumptions and theories of almost every other scholar considered in this course. Section of Weber's article leaves behind a pedestrian focus on tables full of numbers and launches into a discussion of the proper sort of public policy for a country that is experiencing the rapid urbanization he has described. He begins with a wonderful quote from David Balfour, the British politician, advancing the view that migration from rural areas into the cities is the result of what he calls natural laws, meaning mainly economic principles of labor moving to the place where wages are highest due to greater productivity. As Weber admits, if we assume that this is simply a reaction to the operation of some kind of natural laws, we should not meddle with such migration at all, and in fact there is nothing we can really do about it anyway. But in fact, Weber takes strong exception to this laissez-faire doctrine. First, he points out that shifting from agriculture to industry does not have to mean moving from rural areas to large cities, because as he shows us, the industries themselves already were shifting away from the largest cities in 1900. If Adna Weber could see the huge new manufacturing plants built by car companies, tire companies, and other corporate giants in rural areas throughout the United States today, no doubt he would give a happy nod of satisfaction and say, "I told you so." But he is not content just to point out that urban life and industrial jobs do not have to be linked together. He disagrees fundamentally with the idea that cities themselves should just be allowed to develop according to private interests. We should not be, quote, permitting cities to grow up haphazard, following the lines marked out by cow paths, and in after years rectifying the mistake by enormous expenditures for wider and straighter streets and underground subways, as Paris, Boston, and other great cities have done, unquote. Edna Weber ends his article by coming down squarely on the side of people who see the city as a completely new, man-made environment that cannot be left to natural laws because it is not a natural but an artificial place. According to this view, the city as a man-made environment absolutely must be planned, controlled, and adapted to the welfare of urban populations. This is the point of view behind the entire discipline of urban planning, which attempts to control and direct private interests of individuals on the assumption that such planning can prevent some people from trampling on the rights and quality of life of other people in cities. The debate over the wisdom of this position, and, if you accept it, over just how the city should be planned and organized, continues to the present